Operation Liberation was assigned to Northern Asia. The majority of these forces would move down the coast, clearing eastern China, while the rest moved up towards the Arctic. At the far northwest of the continent, 12th Army had landed with 1,500 mech warriors and over 20,000 infantry. Their main opponent was not the solitary East Siberian Defense Regiment, but rather the cold, which at times dipped as low as -70 degrees. Landings were split between Yakutsk and Magadan, with their primary objective to secure the Russian end of the Bering Strait. Alaska seemed a probable entry point when it came time for the North American campaign, so Kerensky attempted to capture the transoceanic tunnels to aid in that endeavour. Unfortunately, saboteurs had already detonated all 10 tunnels, including those that ran through Iceland. Instead, 12th Army set about building infrastructure that would help arriving troops transit Siberia. The rest of the Northern Asia battle group landed in Manchuria. The Zarpita division touched down at Shenyang and secured the city for 16th Army after the third day. From there, they moved to take the surrounding cities and advanced onto the Korean peninsula. 13th Army, spearheaded by the Punjab Pass Division, focused on Harbin. Only a single brigade opposed them, which steadily gave ground. This was a ruse, though, to draw the SLDF in. At the spaceport, the Flying Nuns had seconds to celebrate an easy victory before a nuclear detonation wiped out almost the entire division. Over the next few days, several more strategic rounds were fired by militia artillery, but all were intercepted in the air and their launch sites destroyed. The militia's fanatical defense of Harbin would see the greatest use of WMDs during the first year of the campaign, though thankfully only one would detonate. The 308th pressed ahead, and by February 5th, the Imperial forces had fled across the Songhua River. As soon as they cleared the city, warships overhead opened fire, killing the defenders to the last man.
The Corps of Engineers played an essential role in Operation Liberation. Their list of tasks were wide-ranging, from construction to bomb disposal. One particularly notable action came at Harbin, when the withdrawing militia demi-brigade rigged a nuclear weapon to detonate after they crossed the Songhua River. Thankfully, the military engineers were on hand and able to disarm the device. Less headline-grabbing but arguably more important to the war effort was the construction efforts going on within eastern Siberia. The SLDF had determined that this would be a major staging post for the majority of the regular army once the time came to move against North America. Unfortunately, the infrastructure in the region was sorely lacking. The Corps of Engineers spent 2777 fortifying the Trans-Siberian maglev tracks and road network to handle the anticipated increase in traffic and to protect it against air raids launched out of Alaska by the 88th Amaris Fusiliers. While their duty wasn't glorious, individuals like Cyrus Elam, who was fiercely loyal to Kerensky after his family had been killed during the Amaris coup, still earned a great deal of respect within the SLDF.
To the west, the China battle group had made a heavily dispersed landing across the Gobi Desert. 2nd Army landed to the west and split itself in two. The Denebola Division and Hellraisers from Heaven pushed north into Mongolia. Ulaanbaatar had become a haven for those pro-Amaris forces who had fought in the Periphery Uprising and were less than pleased to see the SLDF. Despite local resistance, the capital was taken in short order. The rest of 2nd Army headed south into sparsely populated western China. 19th Army, meanwhile, was heading southeast to secure the northern Chinese districts in February, then began preparing for a confrontation at Xi'an. The two armies assigned to the Indian subcontinent would have the greatest number of civilians to liberate. Mercifully, the three Amaris divisions in the region were relatively spread out, and so could be dealt with individually. The India battle group worked in concert to liberate Jaipur. Both made landfall south of the city and promptly ran into partisan resistance. The entire Rajasthan district was on the verge of revolt, which threatened to spread across the rest of the Indian subcontinent. Defending the city were 11 conventional militia regiments from the pro-Amaris training camp. Taking that complex became the primary objective, which they achieved on February 7th. The militia was gradually pushed back into the Old Town, turning the battle into an all-infantry affair. The last survivors attempted to flee north, but were caught at Mansagar Lake on February 18th. Most surrendered, but a few made it to the Amber Fort and fought to the last. The Central Asia Battle Group faced perhaps the most diverse environments during their campaign on Terra, from frozen Siberia to the scorching Middle East. They landed as one outside Astana, just north of the main opposition in the region. The Graham Division secured the city in short order, while the rest of 3rd Army advanced into the Urals. The Screaming Eagles and New Earth Division led 4th Army south to Baikonur, the largest freight spaceport on the continent. A 2-day battle with the 4th Amaris Legionnaires ensued, with a large portion of the spaceport destroyed during the fighting. The Imperial troops attempted to withdraw towards the Aral Sea, but were hunted down. Meanwhile, a detachment from 4th Army successfully liberated Ashgabat, Samarkand and Tashkent. Western Russia was one of the most heavily industrialized regions on the planet, alongside Germany and Eastern China. It was therefore a key strategic target. But on top of that, it held a personal significance for the commanding general. Kerensky had made landfall with one half of the Eastern Europe battle group at Gagarin. The 33rd Amaris Dragoons and 9th Hegemony Patriots stood in the way of his reunion with his wife and children, and time was of the essence. The local Kryptia had been holding public executions in Moscow, as they had in many cities across Earth since the arrival of the SLDF in system. To slow their approach, saboteurs had destroyed many of the bridges along the Moskva River, but the cold winter left it safe for infantry and light armour to cross the ice and construct pontoon bridges where needed, supported by the jump-equipped mechs of the East Hartford Division. As 11th Army approached, the Clockwork and North American divisions, led by Major General James McEvedy, flanked around to the north to secure the main escape road, while the Blue Star Division did the same south of Moscow. On February 11th, Kerensky's task force entered the city. The Hegemony Patriot defence at the Outer Ring Road was quickly overrun, but as they approached the Moskva River, the Dragoons launched an assault down Tikhonov Avenue. By the 15th, SLDF reinforcements had driven them back, and they were again advancing into the Arbat and Yakimanka districts. The next day, the commander of the Patriots personally surrendered to Kerensky at Bolotnya Square. The Dragoons abandoned their headquarters at the Kremlin and fled east through the gap in the encirclement. This is exactly what Kerensky had planned for, hoping that they would leave Moscow if they saw a way out, and thus reduce civilian casualties. Outside the city, they ran headfirst into a pair of reserve divisions and were promptly surrounded by the entire army. They held their ground for 1 hour before they too called for surrender. Kerensky, however, had just witnessed the devastation of his hometown and was not inclined to accept their offer. The standoff lasted for 2 hours, the Dragoons certain of their impending doom, before the commanding general finally cooled and accepted their surrender. Kerensky now returned to Moscow on a personal mission. He and his bodyguard Jerome Winson led a small team of trusted officers to locate his family. Despite all the odds, their identities have remained a secret throughout the occupation, and Alexander was able to reunite with them for the first time in over a decade. Katusha Ludmilova had actually been an active part of the Moscow resistance, making her survival all the more extraordinary. The commanding general's family wasn't the only reunion in Moscow, as records suggest that Jerome Winson also found his younger sister Jennifer living nearby. 17th Army dispersed itself across several landing sites within Ukraine, taking aim at the Sverdlovsk Castle Bryan and the two major cities of Kiev and Odessa. The fight for the capital was relatively straightforward. Independent regiments landed along the main escape roads to the north, while the main task force approached from the south, spearheaded by the 16th Mechanized Infantry. Most of the defensive positions they found had been abandoned, and all but one regiment of militia laid down their arms. The western half of the city was secured by February 6th, and 4 days later, Kiev was liberated. From there, they headed northwest to regroup with elements of 11th Army, taking Minsk by the end of the month. The Outreach Division had landed at Mykolaiv. Turning east, they ran into opposition halfway to their objective, but managed to break through on the 5th. They faced a far greater challenge when they reached the bottleneck where rivers and lakes flowed into the Black Sea. The 422nd Amaris Cavaliers had chained Odessa's residents to the fortifications and emplacements along the coastal highway. Kerensky grimly ordered the advance despite the civilian cost, but General al-Nasser instead devised a novel strategy to circumvent the defences. He sent his fastest units to flank far to the north around the lakes, while a pair of regiments submerged themselves in the Black Sea, emerging to strike at the Cavaliers' undefended rear. On February 14th, they succeeded in liberating Odessa, though much of the city had been devastated. At Sverdlovsk, the Chara Cossacks and Thai militia managed to secure the exits within the first 5 days, but the 21st Amaris Dragoons within would not give up its hold for months yet. With warships manoeuvring overhead, the rest of the task force began heading east, back across the border into Russia, towards the site of one of the most infamous battles of World War II, the city formerly known as Stalingrad.
While fighting to liberate the Crimean Peninsula, 17th Army received unexpected aid from a rogue AEAF training battalion led by a former SLDF officer, Gerald McKinniston. After the coup, the major had been told that Alexander Kerensky had ordered the assassination of Richard Cameron as a first step in a plot to take over the Star League. But the Kryptia had always suspected his loyalty to the Empire was weak and so moved to eliminate Gerald in 2776. A successful guerrilla campaign alongside his loyal cadets led him to a confrontation with Colonel Marcus Berger, nephew to one of Amaris's chief advisors and one of the 2 surviving bodyguards, who had accompanied the Emperor to his fateful final meeting with the First Lord. Plagued by guilt at what he had witnessed, Berger provided McKinniston with a security recording from within the Royal Palace's throne room on the day of the coup, before taking his own life. The major survived long enough to see the SLDF return to Terra, after which the information he possessed promptly made its way to the commanding general, proving beyond question Richard's ultimate fate.
The Northern Europe battle group had a large area to cover and many former nations to liberate. But at the start of the operation would focus on the major industrial sites at Berlin and the Ruhr conurbation, as well as the European Theatre Command headquarters within the Sandhurst Castle Bryan. 10th Army opted for 2 landing sites on either side of the German capital. Magdeburg was secured within just a few hours by the Erwin Rommel Division and 2 jump infantry divisions of 26th Corps, after which they spread out in all directions, liberating several towns in the first week. Meanwhile, 39th Corps moved from Seelow to Frankfurt an der Oder to the east of Berlin. Heading up the Spree River, they ran into their first real opposition. Germany was occupied by 3 Hegemony Patriot divisions, the 2nd and 19th around Berlin, and the 10th far to the west. The former were one of the first of their kind, created shortly after the founding of the Empire. As such, they received the best training under the Hector Roe Imperial Division, and were fiercely loyal to Amaris, having far fewer conscripts in their unit than their later counterparts. The 19th Hegemony Patriots, by comparison, were only weeks old and were about to have their first engagement, when on February 9th, Together as One reached Potsdam. The Green recruits held up well until the SLDF forded the lake and attacked from the rear. The unit surrendered by the end of the day. A fast flanking force moved around to the south to secure Schönefeld spaceport, while the rest headed through the Spandau district to take Tegel spaceport on the 11th. To the east of the city, back to the Stone Age was fought to a standstill by the 2nd Hegemony Patriots, but the Pride of Carentan were able to ford the Langer Sea on February 14th, racing to encircle the defenders. Only a last-second escape through Vogelsdorf allowed them to withdraw into the city. Another flanking attack across the Havel River into Grunewald Forest allowed them to bypass the defences within the western suburbs, but the city centre itself was heavily fortified. On the 20th, the Pride of Carentan crossed the canal to seize the ancient Tempelhof spaceport, cutting off the last avenue of escape. The SLDF began to tighten the noose 2 days later, prompting many defections and eventually a full mutiny against the Amaris general. The few survivors surrendered on February 28th. 15th Army had split its strength between Great Britain and the Low Countries. The latter task force of 3 divisions had 2 objectives. First, they took quick control of Amsterdam and Brussels to ensure those forces around the Ruhr didn't head west. The rest of the detachment moved along the coast and then through the Channel Tunnel to secure both ends of the vital continental link. The remaining 10 divisions would land in England. 15th Army's primary objective remained the capture of Sandhurst, but this was still months from completion. The Devils of Devil's Rock were landing 100 kilometers west to seize a biological weapons lab, while the Manteuffel Division took the important spaceports at Heathrow and Northolt. As the 326th approached London, they came under heavy fire from the Burning Tigers, the mercenary unit responsible for the mass slaughter of civilians on Helen. Now at divisional strength, the Mercs were working in tandem with the 17th Amaris Lancers. The regular army pushed ahead until they reached Gunnersbury, after which they established observation posts around the city to prevent a breakout, before waiting for reinforcements. The Geneva Battle Group was tasked with not just the capture of the Terran Hegemony Congress, but also the neighbouring French territories. France was the responsibility of 5th Army, who landed most of their forces southwest of Paris, with a pair of divisions further southeast at Mâcon. The Rigel Centaurus Division led the attack on the capital, which was defended by the 8th Hegemony Patriots. The St. Cyr Military Academy was the site of a lamentable engagement on February 2nd, when a battalion of teenage students loyal to Amaris fought to the bitter end. Versailles was liberated 2 days later. The SLDF continued along the southern edge of the city, and on February 7th secured Orly Spaceport. That same day, the Florida Swamp Foxes crossed the Seine River. The 150th and 197th began launching probes into the city proper, with infantry moving in to secure the 14th and 15th arrondissements in the days after. Meanwhile, the Carver Division was working its way through the southern expanse of the city, beyond the Périphérique. By the 15th, they had pushed up to Austerlitz station, securing the Ile de la Cité 4 days later. The Patriots had been pushed back into a pocket around the École Militaire, but as the New Orleans Division closed to finish them off, a tactical warhead detonated, almost destroying the Patriots and SLDF alike, along with a large chunk of central Paris. Lyon was relatively bloodless, as the garrison had withdrawn to Grenoble. There, they held back the superior numbers of the SLDF, who were forced to approach down the narrow valleys. A task force landed to the south of the city, surrounding the defenders, who were destroyed in the early morning hours of February 20th. The battle for the capital would conclude early the next month with the capture of Wassy Spaceport. Nearby, the lead army of the Geneva Battle Group was making their assault on the Terran Hegemony capital. Most of 18th Army had landed just south of the border, while a small task force landed further north along the shores of Lake Geneva. By February 2nd, they had spread out to secure the neighbouring towns. 2 other divisions did the same in France, while the Tobruk Division was leading the main assault force north across the border. The capital was one of the most heavily defended sites on Earth, with the 99th Amaris Dragoons, 2nd Tartan Brigade, and 13th Hegemony Patriots standing guard. The Northern Task Force was the first to be engaged at Versoix. By February 7th, the SLDF had pushed the Tartan Brigade back to Geneva Spaceport, but could progress no further on account of the heavily fortified facility. Around this time, the rest of the SLDF reached the southern expanse of the city, while artillery support provided by troops across the border at Jura finally broke the Tartan Brigade's defences, allowing the Flanders Division to take the spaceport for themselves. The Imperial unit withdrew back towards the Hegemony Congress, where the Patriots were busy fortifying the complex. By the 12th, the Dragoons had been pushed back across the Arve River. Fighting out of the Old Town, they held the Tobruk Division back until the regular army were able to secure a beachhead on February 19th. Fleeing north back across the Rhône, the Dragoons tried to block pursuit by destroying the bridges, but enough remained for the Stalag forces to give chase. With most of the city now secure, the 8 regular army divisions settled down for a long siege. Securing the Mediterranean was essential to cover the southern flank of operations in Europe and prevent Amar's troops based in Africa from heading north. On the Iberian Peninsula, First Army touched down at Avila. Most units headed towards the capital, but heavy winter snows slowed the infantry considerably. The Hannibal Division forged on ahead though. On February 5th, they entered the city, only to find it totally bereft of Imperial forces. They captured the royal palace in short order, and Madrid was declared liberated the next day. Partisans remained, which forced the SLDF to enact martial law for a time, but by the end of the month they had secured the entire peninsula and crossed over into France. A small detachment was also airlifted across the Mediterranean to secure the Gibraltar Strait. They would be the first to set foot in Africa during Operation Liberation. The second unit in the Southern Europe battle group was 6th Army, who landed just north of Naples. The situation in Italy had deteriorated into outright anarchy, perpetuated by General Antilos Lagos's Greenhaven Gestapo. They had spent the past decade ransacking the Italian peninsula, defacing many of the 3,000-year-old monuments. Bandits had de facto control of the region, the strongest of which were recruited into the Gestapo themselves, which had grown to divisional strength. Securing Naples fell to the colony commanders and Lightning Bees, a difficult task which they achieved with merit. They finally began to move out on February 27th. With the ground invasion of Earth well underway, Admiral Grech next turned his attention to the secondary targets within the Terran system. First on the list was Earth's moon. After the destruction of the STS bases by SLM warships, the path was clear for Marines to descend in force on the major population centers. Lunar City housed the largest contingent of Imperial forces, 5,000 all told, but a brief 2-week campaign saw the moon secured by mid-February. The peculiarities of infantry combat in a pressurized environment forced the use of low lethality munitions, which ultimately kept the struggle a largely bloodless affair on both sides. Next were the terraformed terrestrial planets, Mars and Venus. Both housed military bases that at one time had formed the war triad alongside Sandhurst. They had been ruined by nuclear strikes during the coup, but there were almost 300 million civilians still living on the worlds. Landings on Mars began on February 9th at Olympus Mons and faced little opposition. The majority of the garrison had been withdrawn to Earth as soon as the SLDF had appeared in system. Now the civilians overthrew the Imperial government, and the planet was secure by March.
Mars had long been the playground of the ultra-rich. The low gravity allowed for architecture that would have been impossible on Earth, and vanity projects like kilometer-tall statues dotted the dusty landscape. Under the Amaris Empire, it became a major enclave for Stefan's supporters among the nobility, with the rest of the planet's population existing purely to cater to their every whim. In case that is lost on you, imagine a planet full of narcissistic yes-men. Ironically, sounds like Terra as well, but I digress. Governance of Mars fell to Duke Reginald Windsor Small V, a close political ally and descendant of the old British monarchy. Despite the close ties, Amaris was quick to recognize the planet as a lost cause once the Star League Navy appeared in system and extracted whatever forces he could for his own defense. Windsor Small was left hopelessly outgunned and was executed by the planet's underclass in a mass revolt. Mars became a major staging post and hospital site for the SLDF's continuing campaign on Terra, as well as being a jumping-off point for refugees fleeing the carnage.
Venus promised more of a challenge. As part of its terraforming procedures, the Department of Mega Engineering had constructed an enormous orbital sunshade, the largest man-made object in history. Amaris now hoped to employ this device as a weapon in Operation Icarus, but rushed miscalculations on the part of his officers resulted in the gravitational stresses tearing the sunshade apart. Nobody yet knew it, but through that error they had resigned Venus to a long, slow fate of environmental collapse, and today the world is all but abandoned. Also left in a dangerous, deteriorating orbit was Aphrodite Station. The sudden arrival of the SLN at a proximity point left the 24 docked Imperial warships scrambling into action. As they all disengaged from the station at once, the facility began tumbling towards the ground. A 7-hour engagement put an end to the last significant Amaris naval force, but when the Stalag rushed to save Aphrodite Station, they were targeted by STS batteries on Venus. The attacks soon stopped when Imperial forces on the ground stormed their bases and disarmed their colleagues. Their surrender allowed the orbital facility to be saved. Last on the list of targets for the Stalag Navy were new shipyards from which to service their devastated fleet, which now contained many vessels too badly damaged to safely jump to more secure systems to undertake repairs. The swift capture of a handful of independent facilities within the Jovian Trojans, such as the Mercator Campion base at Andromache, went some way to accomplishing that need. The main goal was the colossal Titan shipyards, the largest commercial complex in existence. Taking it wouldn't be easy, as the station was rigged to explode if the occupants felt they were about to be overpowered. Instead, a pair of warships, the SLS Ocean and Unity City, jumped to the far side of Saturn, burned onto an intercept trajectory with Titan, and then shut down their vessels to mask their approach. After silently slingshotting their way around the gas giant, 6 boarding craft disembarked and made course corrections to bring them up to the shipyard. As they drew closer, the warships powered up, drawing all eyes towards them and creating an opening for the shuttles to land, after which the commandos on board secured the facility in just 15 minutes. The only situation that arose during this time was at the de facto Belter capital Metis. The massive asteroid had been hollowed out in the early days of space exploration, and more than 50,000 people now lived in the enormous 10-kilometer-long revolving habitat. Amaris security forces took the population hostage and threatened to detonate the entire facility. While Stalag negotiators kept them talking, a commando team was able to infiltrate the asteroid through old mining tunnels and eliminate the die-hard Amaris goons with only a handful of civilian casualties. 8th Army spent March pushing south through Honshu, psychologically preparing themselves for what lay ahead. 20th Army, meanwhile, faced a difficult crossing. For starters, they broke off a pair of divisions to take the Aquarius Arcology, a massive complex located on the inland sea. It took them a whole month to breach the compound, bypass the defensive drones, and secure the naval spaceport. The main battle was happening at Shimonoseki Crossing though. As it happened in the north, the tunnels had been destroyed, and the solitary bridge became the scene of intense fighting. Only when combat engineers reopened one of the tunnels on March 19th were the SLDF infantry able to flank the defenders and secure both sides of the bridge. The last of the chasseurs were destroyed 3 days later. Across the Sea of Japan, 16th Army completed the liberation of the Korean peninsula and began closing on Beijing. Their approach slowed to a crawl after running into a pair of AEAF divisions and more than 24 militia regiments. A concentrated effort over 9 days advanced them a mere 20 kilometers before they had to regroup. Further south, the 16th Hegemony Patriots were chased out of Bangkok on March 2nd and destroyed 10 days later. Far to the northwest, the Mongolian detachment of 2nd Army reached Irkutsk on March 5th. With that, the SLDF now had full control of the Trans-Siberian Maglev tracks. The southern detachment was moving through Tibet, liberating Lhasa on the 11th. Their battle group partner, 19th Army, was headed towards Xi'an. When they reached the outskirts of the city on March 19th, they were greeted by large crowds of civilians, but they were soon horrified to discover that many among them were wearing remote explosives. The 201st Amaris Lancers fully exploited all 8 million people within Xi'an during their defense of the city. Around 1/3 of the population was killed during the following weeks. The Lancers were finally forced out on April 9th, but rounded up 10,000 hostages before departing, which they herded along with them to prevent overhead warships from raining retribution on them. The SLDF was forced to break off pursuit and deal with the humanitarian crisis they had left behind. In India, 9th Army split itself in two. The Bryant Division led a charge against Agra, while the newly appointed Major General Lauren Hayes took command of the Ulysses S. Grant Division's assault on New Delhi. On March 10th, the 151st reached Gurgaon and entered into combat with the 29th Amaris Chasseurs. The engagement was short-lived, the Imperial forces soon withdrawing to the nearby spaceport in an attempt to flee. 2 of the 5 dropships were shot down by aerospace pilots. while the others were tracked to Isfahan, where they became 4th Army's problem. Unfortunately, the capture of the two cities did not bring peace, as both Haryana and Uttar Pradesh rose in rebellion against both the Empire and Star League. The King Henry Division was leading 5 other divisions of 14th Army south through Gujarat, liberating Surat on March 9th and reaching the outskirts of Mumbai 2 days later. The 8th Maris Dragoons held their ground along the Vaitarna River for a time before withdrawing back to Vasai Creek. The crossings along the eastern edge of the city were collapsed, forcing the SLDF to attack from the fortified north. The Dragoons managed to hold them there for 5 days before they were again forced to withdraw, this time heading towards the spaceport near Mahim Bay. Unfortunately for them, they never made it, as the city rose up in rebellion around them and executed their oppressors. Soon, most of India was engulfed in a civil war, save only for the northwest districts.
Despite centuries of development and prosperity under the Star League, the age-old imbalance between the haves and have-nots on Earth had never been addressed. It was a problem that had plagued the planet since the days of the Terran Alliance, when humanity was making its first tentative steps into space. Though nation-states had long since been done away with, the fact remained that those first colonies had the closest ties to the administrative districts of Europe and North America. What were most often the richest hegemony worlds continued to funnel wealth back to the countries that established them. For the less affluent regions, neither the Ameris Empire nor Star League had shown any likelihood of resolving the problem. When the Civil War reached their own homes, they saw both Stefan and Alexander as oppressors and took up arms against them. It's unclear whether Kerensky had naively failed to predict the rebellion or knew all along that there would be trouble and yet had little option but to press ahead regardless.
Fourth Army passed through Turkmenistan in early March, then split in two. The Ricochet Rabbits and Red Diamond Division advanced into Iran, taking Tehran on March 8th, and then dispatched the recently arrived 29th Amaris Chasseurs 3 days later. They continued west through Baghdad and Damascus, reaching the Mediterranean on April 2nd. The other half raced onwards into Afghanistan, taking Kabul on the 24th. By the end of the month, they had crossed the border again and liberated Islamabad. St. Petersburg was liberated on March 17th, with the last holdouts in northwest Russia falling to 11th Army in the following weeks, while another detachment advanced into Poland. To the south, the 17th completed their liberation of Ukraine. Only the Castle Bryan still stood, but with the occupants surrounded and warships overhead, they could retask divisions with new objectives for the following months. Germany was likewise mostly in SLDF hands by the end of March, save for a collection of towns in the east held by the 10th Hegemony Patriots. The 75th Light Horse managed to liberate 3 cities in southern Germany entirely by themselves. The largest obstacle they faced came at an airfield outside Munich, where a pair of experimental super heavy Berk 2s laid waste to the approaching Light Horse until they ran out of ammo. Across the Channel, orbital bombardment at the Sandhurst Castle Bryan by SLS Wellesley had rendered the facility largely inoperable. On March 11th, a Special Forces team infiltrated the complex through narrow wiring conduits, allowing 15th Army to take control of the outermost level of the complex, with 3 further rings of defences still to go. The assault on London remained on hold until the situation at Sandhurst was resolved, but the Calais detachment took Gatwick and then set up positions in the east of the city at Queen Elizabeth II Park. The Manteuffel Division likewise reinforced their position at Ealing Common. Throughout March, 5th Army completed the liberation of France, but it was a campaign that would cost them dearly. A full third of the unit would be listed as casualties, which was crippling to morale. The Iberian Peninsula was similarly pacified, but with little actual fighting. It was suspected that the Imperial unit defending the region had never left, but simply abandoned their posts and fled as small groups into the countryside. In early March, 6th Army was making swift northward progress when they came under fire from chemical weapons launched from the Ferentino Hills. The effects were devastating, and the Stalag Navy quickly sought retribution. The Greenhaven Gestapo withdrew into the capital, taking up positions within hospitals and schools to dissuade further use of orbital weapons. Precision strikes were still made when possible. On March 9th, the SLDF reached the city outskirts, taking the spaceport to prevent the mercs from escaping. Fighting within the city was intense, but mercifully brief, the Greenhaven Gestapo again withdrawing north on March 19th. By this point, military intelligence had confirmed that General Antilos Legos was with his unit, which was now less than a regiment in strength. The Amaris Empire Strategic Operations Director had been the mastermind behind some of the worst atrocities unleashed on the SLDF and the hegemony during Operation Chieftain. His capture was a priority. The mercs were finally cornered at Ferrara, whereupon they turned and surrendered. There is some controversy over what happened next. Some say that there were mass executions, others simply that the surrender was refused after similar attempts in Rome resulted in the detonation of suicide vests. Ultimately, the unit was wiped out to a man, and Legos' body could never be identified. The first 3 months of Operation Liberation had been a tremendous success for the SLDF. They had survived the flight through the system and the perilous landings with far fewer casualties than they had feared, though the numbers of dead were still sobering. They had freed huge areas of Eurasia from the oppressive Amaris rule, and were now moving into the secondary administrative districts to complete the liberation of the continent. Most of their armies had linked up, creating a near unbroken chain from coast to coast. Their arrival had marked the death knell for the faltering Starleague economy. It had never recovered from the coup, but had managed to just barely stay afloat. The disruption of all-out war on Earth led to an inevitable and terminal collapse. That same fate felt imminent for the Empire as a whole. Mercenaries in particular, with no links to Amaris other than the obscene riches they had won or stolen in his employ, were running for cover. One of the worst, Darabont's Damned, lifted off Solokofan and disappeared out into the periphery. Several major hurdles still stood ahead of the Stalag Defence Force. Only one of the 8 Castles Bryan had been taken. The Terran Congress at Geneva was holding out, and going into April, the SLDF now faced the daunting challenge of liberating 3 major capitals, Beijing, London, and Tokyo. The latter was the most populated city in human history, with upper estimates of around 50 million inhabitants within the 14,000 square kilometers. On April 2nd, 8th Army reached the outskirts. Holding the Japanese capital were the 71st Amaris Dragoons and the 197th Amaris Cavaliers. Their first encounter came when the Dragoons disrupted an attempted river crossing at Sakai, and then continued to pressure them as they advanced from the north. An SLDF detachment was sent on a wide flanking route east towards Tokyo Bay, capturing the spaceport at Narita on April 19th. Fear of encirclement forced the Dragoons to withdraw back into the city centre, and 4 days later, 8th Army had reformed at the Arakawa River.
During the Amaris coup, the Terran militia had largely stood apart from the fighting. Their loyalties lay with their home administrative districts, not with the Greater Star League or ruling House Cameron. While this remained true within the Empire, Amaris propaganda had portrayed Kerensky and his SLDF as baby killers, come to enslave the people of Earth and restore the vile despot Cameron. Upon their arrival, the response by militia was mixed. Several took up arms and fought alongside the Imperial forces, whereas others surrendered at the first opportunity or declared their neutrality. At best, they helped to restore order after the regular army had crushed the AEAF. The fiercest resistance was found within western China. At Harbin, militia detonated a nuclear bomb to deny the 13th Army control of the spaceport, then tried to do the same within the city as they fled. The Beijing defenders were by far the most numerous. They outnumbered the 2 Amaris divisions and even the approaching 16th Army. The SLDF was fought to a near standstill by the militia as they closed on the city, providing them with one of their greatest challenges of the campaign.
Beijing had two AEAF divisions, the 8th Amaris Fusiliers and 3rd Hegemony Patriots, but also dozens of Chinese militia regiments. The 7 SLDF divisions, all suffering from more than a decade of campaigning, could only just match those numbers. Their efforts so far had achieved only the capture of Tianjin on April 6th. Soon after, reinforcements from 13th Army arrived, giving the SLDF the clear numbers advantage they needed. By the 15th, they had taken the spaceport and eastern reaches of the city, then broke through to the city centre 4 days later. The Imperial troops withdrew west, with the King's Own jump troops in hot pursuit. However, after almost catching their prey, the trail suddenly went cold. Only later was the secret entrance to the Tien Shan Castle Bryan discovered. Warships manoeuvred overhead to ensure that nobody left the facility, while 16th Army returned to liberating the eastern Chinese administrative districts. In Europe, 6th Army completed their liberation of northern Italy. 10th Army did the same in eastern Germany, but not before the 10th Hegemony Patriots managed to withdraw back into the Bochum Castle Bryan. The rest of the European battle groups began preparations for their next objectives in Central Europe and the Balkans. At London, the Burning Tigers were growing increasingly worried about their encircled position and attempted a breakout on April 15th. Crossing at Battersea, they headed southwest along the tracks until they were intercepted at Kingston upon Thames, after which they staged a fighting retreat through Richmond Park, back across Putney Bridge, surrendering control of South London to the SLDF. May would see the end of several of the few remaining concentrations of Amaris troops. After their first crossing of the Arakawa River was repulsed by the Amaris Cavaliers, the SLDF instead launched another wide flanking attack, which completed its encirclement on May 3rd, when they reached Kawasaki. While a small detachment secured the southern city, the rest of 8th Army began to close in from all sides. Meanwhile, 20th Army successfully liberated the major cities in southern Honshu. A hard push through Shinanomachi on May 27th successfully split and isolated the defenders, with the dragoons at Shibuya and the cavaliers at Chiyoda. The latter now took up residence at the ancient imperial palace, taking Duke Naruhito and his family hostage. They demanded safe passage to leave the city, or else they would execute the Duke. Kerensky was notified of the situation, but decided that he could not allow the cavaliers to escape. His refusal brought about immediate reprisals, which included the murder of Naruhito's teenage daughter. On June 2nd, a commando team breached the palace, killing the division's command staff. The rest of the unit surrendered the next day. The dragoons attempted to flee north, but were caught before they reached the river. On May 2nd, the Pride of Puget Sound and Wellington Division crossed the Himalayas into Nepal. They were approaching the Kathmandu Castle Bryan, garrisoned by the 2nd Amaris Fusiliers. The fortifications had taken more than a year for the Imperial troops to breach during the Amaris coup, and now the SLDF faced the same problem. They would need to wait for reinforcements from the India battle group before beginning their assault. Meanwhile, the Northern Asia battle group continued south along the Yellow Sea, taking Shanghai on May 29th. London was one of the last objectives in Western Europe. The mercenaries' willingness to abandon the city, which was the heart of pro-Amaris control within the British Isles, had caused internal strife between the two defending divisions. On May 2nd, the building pressure ignited, with spontaneous fighting breaking out between regulars and mercenaries all across the city centre. The Manteuffel division was content to sit back and watch their opponents wear each other out, moving in to disarm the exhausted survivors 3 days later. A few small units broke and ran. The remaining lancers were caught by the 326th at Elephant and Castle, while the last of the Burning Tigers fled their command post at Highbury Stadium and made it to Highgate Wood before their eventual destruction. The Bochum Castle Bryan became the second to fall to the SLDF after a 3-week battle left almost the entire Hegemony Patriot division dead. 10th Army's southern detachment also crossed the border into western Austria. Around the same time, the last defenders at Sandhurst were finally overrun, after a near continual battle for 3.5 months. Unfortunately for the SLDF, General Günther Julian had ample time to wipe the base's memory core, destroying any documents that would aid Kerensky, and then took his own life. More than 50,000 were killed fighting within this one Castle Bryan. The situation at Geneva had taken a turn against the defenders, who had run out of food in late April. The SLDF was offering rations to any soldiers who surrendered, with several individuals and small groups taking them up on the offer. However, the Stalag soldiers had grown fearful of pressing ahead, as rumours were circulating that the defenders had access to a terrifying experimental new battle mech, which had already claimed several kills. A patrol was tasked with rooting out whatever was still lurking in the city, only to stumble into a well-prepared ambush site. The 90-ton prototype Rifleman 3 burst from concealment and obliterated the unit commander with a full alpha from its quartet of Gauss rifles. It continued to pick off mechs from the company, periodically withdrawing to refill its limited ammo reserves, until only 3 were left standing. They finally caught it rearming and were able to detonate the ammo truck, catching the Rifleman 3 in the blast, putting it down for good. By early June, the trickle had become a flood. The dwindling forces attempted to break out, but were caught by a pair of 18th Army independent regiments at the border. The last holdouts within the Terran Congress surrendered on June 10th. Later that month, an SLDF checkpoint picked up an individual trying to board a civilian dropship heading out of the system. It didn't take long for them to see through his false identity, and they discovered him to be none other than the Amaris Empire Minister of Communications, Samir Injari. The head of the Cryptia was taken into custody. Later in 2777, 3rd Army redeployed from the cold climate of Western Siberia to the scorching deserts of the Middle East. The India Battle Group arrived at Kathmandu on June 17th, and in conjunction with 2nd Army, the SLDF forced its way inside to take control the next month. After that, the 9th and 14th returned to India, which was still in open rebellion. It took 4 months for 16th Army to clear out the Tien Shan complex. Thousands were wounded by the Imperial divisions, who fought to the bitter end. Niigata was the penultimate target to be liberated by 8th Army in early July. The Japan Battle Group now closed from both sides on the Takayama Castle Bryan. Inside were the 8th Amaris Legionnaires and the Warriors of Dawn mercenary unit. Both were experienced units that would not make life easy for the SLDF. The 11th Army continued to work with the Kiev detachment as they pushed west into Hungary and Romania. Both were hotbeds of Amaris supporters, and restoring order proved almost impossible. The 2nd Detachment of 17th Army liberated Istanbul on July 11th, then took Sofia 1 week later. 10th Army was advancing in 2 different directions. Vienna fell on June 25th, then Czechia and Slovakia the following month. The other detachment liberated Copenhagen on July 7th, then crossed the Øresund Bridge into Scandinavia. The rest of the Northern Europe battle group joined them early the next month, after taking Ireland in July. The Geneva and Southern Europe battle groups joined forces and began preparing for the first stages of the African campaign. The various Mediterranean islands were taken throughout July and August, and they began launching aerial reconnaissance raids over the southern continent, and even some across the Atlantic. The 1st and 7th Elysian Rangers, which had accompanied the SLDF to Earth, were distressed to find that their home base in Sicily had been ruined. Sadly, neither would survive to the end of the campaign. Later in August, 17th Army also reached Athens, the last European city to be liberated. The depredations of the 201st Amaris Lancers, the unit responsible for the massacre at Xi'an, continued throughout the rest of 2777. The Stalag Navy's difficult decision not to sacrifice the hostages had created a situation where most of the Chinese districts had joined India in open revolt. Only the final destruction of the Lancers at Wuhan in November brought about an end to the rebellion, and India was mollified early the next year.
The Battle for Terra was unquestionably a violent affair that resulted in the deaths of millions of civilians, on top of the military casualties. That said, it was comparatively clean compared to some of the other planets targeted in Operation Chieftain. Scorched earth tactics were seldom employed, and the Empire was particularly reserved in their deployment of WMDs. Kerensky, of course, had completely forbidden their use outside of precision orbital strikes from overhead warships. The worst atrocities that took place happened in China, where the 201st Amarist Lancers committed abhorrent acts, like forcing refugees to detonate hidden explosive charges after they made contact with the SLDF troops, or even strapping civilians to their mechs to deter Kerensky's forces from firing on them. Dealing with this barbarity fell to the 19th Army. At the forefront of their advance was Major General John Fletcher and the liberators of Java, who handled the difficult task with merit. Even after hunting down these perpetrators, they were left with a humanitarian crisis and a region that rose in revolt. The China battle group spent the next 2 years on pacification duty, recuperating from the brutality that they'd witnessed, and in some cases had been forced to deal out themselves.
The 11-month siege of the Sverdlovsk Castle Bryan came to an end on January 19th. Takayama became the last Castle Bryan to fall later that summer, when the Warriors of Dawn were able to negotiate a deal with the SLDF that would allow the unit to leave Earth. Throughout Operation Chieftain, no member of the Stalag Navy had distinguished themselves as much as Admiral Marina Akayev-Cameron. Her anti-STS tactics had saved the lives of many within the SLDF. It's no surprise that Admiral Grech turned to her to sweep up the last of the systems that had been bypassed on the way to Terra. With the fleets repaired and refitted, Akayev-Cameron targeted first the largest drone fleet at Thorin in November 2777. The remnants of her 4th Fleet, now again employing the Project Night Jammers to good effect, next moved to Zolokothin in January, Terra Firma followed in March, and lastly Epsilon Indy in July. Unfortunately, those behind the planning of this side campaign had made a terrible oversight. Kerensky had not spared any of the regular army, instead being content to blockade the Imperial troops on those planets. When the civilians unexpectedly took to the street in protest to the Amarist government, they faced brutal reprisals from the HSF and OPD. The Navy in orbit was powerless to lend any assistance while the garrison forces remained within the cities. Hegemony citizens bore the brunt of their rage and frustration, something which would come back to haunt the Stali. With the Eurasian campaign winding down in 2778, High Command began looking towards their next targets. Among the casualties of Operation Liberation so far were more than 1 million civilians and almost 100,000 from the SLDF, some 30% of the regular army in total. 2 divisions had been destroyed by nuclear detonations, and a further 11 had been disbanded. Penciled in for that summer was the simultaneous invasion of Africa and South America, isolating Stefan Amaris on the North American continent. Each had a trio of functional Castles Bryan, but apart from a few divisions sent across to secure the Straits of Gibraltar, the Stalik had no presence on either landmass so far. Lieutenant General Antonius Solman, who had nearly been killed at his Brazilian residence by an assassination team during the coup, was tasked with drawing up the invasion plan for his home continent. As the difficulties in pacifying China and India continued, Kerensky realized that he could not become bogged down in similar campaigns in the southern hemisphere. Instead, they would use what strength they had left for a final push towards Unity City. Some Imperial units could see the writing on the wall either way, and took the opportunity to flee the planet. Few made it through the blockade, but the 141st Amarist Dragoons were one of the lucky ones. Preparations for the Africa assault continued along the Mediterranean, but this was an SLDF counterintelligence operation to mislead the Empire. The real goal was reaching North America. Earlier in the campaign, the Empire had collapsed the transoceanic tunnels that once ran below the Bering Strait and had even connected Europe through Iceland. Furthermore, defensive installations along the Pacific Wall had been fortified to the point where an amphibious landing would be disastrous. With the American STS batteries intact, orbital maneuvers were out of the question too. That left them 2 approaches. The first was to use low-flying aerodyne dropships such as the Leopard class to skim the surface of the ocean and touch down in Alaska. Beginning in October 2778, the Eastern Europe and Northern Asia battle groups relocated to Chukotka and began training in the Siberian wilderness for the upcoming assault. The second approach was through a narrow corridor over the ocean that would take them to Mexico. The India battle group was selected for this operation. Their route would bring them into range of the Indonesian, Australian and Pacific arrays, and so a supporting campaign pushing south from Asia would clear a path. The Japan battle group relocated to Taiwan and was reinforced by the Malaysia battle group, together taking on responsibility for the Pacific. The Central Asia battle group relocated to India and prepared for their assault on Australia. The attacks were scheduled for January 7th. Before the next phase of Operation Liberation could begin, the SLDF undertook a number of preliminary actions. In November, pathfinders were dispatched to the new continents to identify and mark the best landing sites, while commando teams were tasked with the destruction of the many STS batteries. Several major Indonesian ports were captured in December ahead of the main force's arrival. Things almost went wrong on New Year's Day when a commando team was discovered by the HSF in Mexico, but mass aerial raids over Africa and Southern America meant the HSF report was overlooked. On January 3rd, 2 regiments of the Filtwelt Fusiliers made landfall in Western Australia, heading for the Hammersley SDS arrays. 5 of the installations were captured, while the last 2 were bombarded from orbit. The unit's other 2 regiments landed on the beaches surrounding Perth. They would secure the city on January 7th, moments before the rest of 69th Corps was set to arrive. The Pacific Battle Group departed from their bases late in the night on January 4th. They were supported in their actions by the vast majority of the available Cam Marine regiments, who were best equipped for the terrain. Southeast Asia had a minimum of defenders, but it still proved a costly campaign for the SLDF. 5 transports were destroyed crossing the South China Sea, and the defenders of Io suffered a nuclear strike in the Java Sea. The next morning, the 3 armies made simultaneous landfall across the major islands of Indonesia and the Philippines. 20th faced only a single regiment of defenders, but taking the 3 arrays proved costly as they had to contend with several hostage situations. The Western Islands had 6 battalions of mixed mercenary and hegemony patriot forces, who made full use of ambushes and booby traps to inflict heavy casualties around Lake Laut Tawa. Borneo had the strongest defence in the form of Cutlass Vagabonds, who again used human shields to prevent their destruction and demoralise the SLDF. Commando teams were used to secure the Indonesian STSs where possible, which helped keep civilian casualties to a minimum. In the 48 hours before the invasion of North America was set to begin, 4 Central American STSs were destroyed, clearing a path for 2 divisions of the Mexico battle group to make the crossing. The Australia and Mexico battle groups commenced their attack on the 7th as planned, but on account of extreme weather in Alaska, Operation Anchorhead was postponed until a safe crossing could be attempted. In southern Mexico, the Marne and Ulysses S. Grant divisions risked drops amid the still functioning STS batteries, while the majority of 9th Army landed at safer Acapulco. Almost a full brigade was lost in the approach, but it allowed the SLDF to quickly eliminate the remaining installations and establish air superiority. The 9th dropships now transported the rest of the army to their targets.
Mexico was one of the regions that had been particularly hard hit by Richard Cameron's disastrous rule. Amaris had found support for his takeover not just with the district's nobility, but also among several militant groups. After playing a small part in the coup, these armed gangs joined the fledgling Amaris Empire armed forces as the Mexican Legion, which by the time of Operation Liberation had expanded to 3 full regiments. One of their units was known to be in northern Africa, most likely operating out of the Cairo Castle Bryan. They had repulsed several attempts by the Third Army to move out of the Middle East and establish a presence in Egypt. Their main strength remained in North America, where, unlike the native Terran militia, they would fight against the SLDF's advance every step of the way. Kerensky's assurances that he was not trying to install himself as a military dictator, words meant to belie the fears of the Council Lords, played directly into Amaris's propaganda that the SLDF had come to restore the hated Cameron dynasty.
69th Corps touched down at Perth a few hours after taking off and began a lightning advance east. Far along the coast, an advance team led by the 2537th Jump Infantry Regiment landed at Adelaide, but their beachhead was quickly overrun by the 53rd Amaris Fusiliers, and the task force was virtually wiped out. On January 9th, after sprinting halfway across the continent, 69th avenged their fallen brethren by taking the city. The remaining 3 Third Army Corps now joined them in Australia, with each assigned to one of the coasts. The priority targets for them were eliminating the SDS batteries spread throughout the Great Dividing Range to allow for warship support in the attack on the Glen Valley Castle Bryan. On January 15th, the weather had cleared enough for Operation Anchorhead to commence. The Meteors and Antarctica Division made the first landings along the Seward Peninsula at 0330 Terra Standard Time. Immediately, the 88th Amaris Fusiliers attempted to dislodge them, the first engagements coming 3 hours later. 5 of the 19 landing sites were eliminated, but the others held on thanks to constant sorties launched by SLDF aerospace fighters. One of the units that distinguished itself during the invasion was Major Stephen Cage's 200th Dragoons, who could switch between recon and fast strikes to great effect. Combat engineers were hard at work clearing landing strips in the ice, the first of which was completed at 11:30 Terra Standard Time. Aerodyne dropships now bust across the rest of 11th and 12th Armies. A last-ditch attempt was made by the Empire to halt the invasion when they launched 4 nuclear weapons against the SLDF. Thousands were killed, but Kerensky's forces clung on, and by the end of the month were advancing off the peninsula. The defense of North America was compromised from the get-go, as it was reported that an increasingly unsound Stefan Amaris was taking command of operations. The Pacific Battle Group liberated East Timor and New Guinea in late January, and were now preparing naval assaults against the few remaining SDS batteries spread among the Mariana, Marshall and Solomon Islands. Imperial forces in Melbourne put up a determined defence, but couldn't stand against the 17th and 69th Corps. The rest of 3rd Army regrouped at Canberra on the 30th. With the destruction of the last of the SDS by the Filbert Fusiliers early the next month, warships were called in to bombard the Glen Valley Castle Bryan. The defenders surrendered after just 2 weeks. Throughout the latter stages of the war, rumours began to circulate about 3rd Army's treatment of POWs, with some reports suggesting summary executions or worse. The massacre of HSF and OPD officers finally forced High Command to take action. It was discovered that General Jack Lucas had allowed these atrocities to take place, and so on February 12th, Deputy Commanding General de Chevalier was forced to replace one of his best officers. 4th Army had suffered heavy losses during the Asian campaign, and were now reduced to just a single corps. With most of Australia secure by mid-February, they hopped across to New Zealand, where they faced only light resistance at the White Cliffs Castle Bryan, surrendering only 2 days into the bombardment after a mutiny within. Back in Central America, the Ulysses S. Grant Division was approaching Mexico City. Rather than try to fight the far larger force, the 1st Mexican Legion sabotaged as much infrastructure as they could within the capital before withdrawing north, leaving a humanitarian crisis in their wake. The SLDF was aided in their recovery efforts by the 44th Hegemony Patriot Regiment, after which they set off in pursuit. At this moment, the Wraiths, acting as the lead element of 14th Army, made landfall around Guadalajara. They moved east and intercepted the fleeing AEAF unit at Celaya, destroying them utterly in just 1 hour. With the Pacific SDSs offline, the rest of 14th Army flew across the ocean to make landfall in Sonora and along the Baja Peninsula. This drew the attention of nearby Imperial forces, who moved south across the border, while flights launched out of California and Nevada kept the SLDF bottled up throughout February. The Wraiths were heading up the coast, attempting to regroup, but faced their own obstacle at Los Mochis. The lead armies of Operation Anchorhead succeeded in capturing Nome at the beginning of the month, securing its valuable spaceport. This allowed for the heavier elements of the 11th and 12th to be brought across, and they began moving towards their next objectives. The former made its way through the Alaska Range, arriving at Anchorage 1 week after 17th Army had made their naval assault. The latter moved towards Fairbanks, destroying the polar SDSs and securing the city by late February. The rest of the Northern Inland Battle Group now made landfall in North America. Between them, the 5 armies wiped out the Empire's 2 divisions tasked with the defense of Alaska. In the Southern Hemisphere, the Australian forces were redesignated as the California Battle Group ahead of their planned redeployment to North America. 4th and 7th Armies arrived at Honolulu in the final week of February, alongside what was left of the volunteer brigades. Where once there had been 12 brigades, more than 90% casualties had reduced them to a mere 8 battalions. Amaris's decision to withdraw forces from the East Coast to reinforce Alaska would prove particularly short-sighted, as it allowed an opportunity to land another wave of armies along the Atlantic. The former Northern Europe, now Northeast Battle Group, moved from Iceland to liberate Greenland in February. They would soon be landing along the Labrador coast. 1st Army was the lead unit of the new Southeast Battle Group, hopping from the Azores to Bermuda. 9th Army was determined to reach Florida ahead of their arrival to support the landing. They crossed the Rio Grande early in March and began clearing the heavily defended cities along the Gulf of Mexico. Major General Loren Hayes of the Ulysses S. Grant Division spearheaded the attacks, losing an arm in the fierce fighting around Houston. 3rd Army, straight from their victory in Australia, touched down along the Gold Coast, and with support from 14th Army, overran the brigade of defenders in the area. The 2 units moved inland to destroy the SDS batteries outside Los Angeles and the fighter bases that had been given the 14th such trouble in Mexico. 9th Army reached their objective the following week, just as the 1st were making landfall. The 2 of them regrouped at New Orleans to fight off an attack from the north, after which the new arrivals laid siege to the 203rd Republican Guard within the Hilton Head Castle Bryan, while 9th Army spent the rest of the month regrouping with their battle group partner back west. Further up the Atlantic coastline, the Northeast Battle Group divided itself between Long Island and Western Canada. On loan to 10th Army was the George S. Patton Division, which spearheaded the attack on New York. There they faced off against the 18th Amaris Chasseurs, the so-called Death's Head Regiment, led by Colonel Gunther von Strang. His reputation for cruelty among the locals had earned him the nickname Vampire, and he was one of the most despised among the SLDF. His unit was crushed trying to escape from LaGuardia spaceport.
The Strang family had been firm Amaris supporters for generations. The Vampire, Gunther von Strang, had been awarded control over much of Western North America in much the same way Lagos had been given Italy as his personal fief. If this includes Canada, why did we get stuck with a guy with an edgy alias? His death at the hands of the SLDF was a blow to the Empire's control of the region. Out in the periphery, one of the loyalist elements that had gone to ground during Kerensky's invasion was led by Baron Nico von Strang. Located on the planet Erin, they lay beyond the new border established by the Lyran Commonwealth during Operation Almeric. Crucially, they were now in possession of one of the Empire's few remaining shipyards. In 2780, Nico would establish the Barony of Strang as a successor to the now defunct Rimworld's Republic, using the threat of another Lyran invasion to exert complete control of the planet's population and rule as a petty king. I mean, as far as that goes, petty king is probably an upgrade.
The majority of the Northeast Battle Group headed west, sweeping along both sides of the Great Lakes. 15th Army broke off a detachment to besiege the Port Alfred Castle Bryan, while the rest of the unit continued ahead. Meanwhile, 2 10th Army divisions headed south from New York, and by the end of March had met up in Virginia with elements of 1st Army advancing north. Over in the northwest, the Inland Battle Group had moved into the Canadian Yukon, while 11th and 17th Armies had the difficult task of moving through the coast mountains within British Columbia. All told, the Alaskan campaign would suffer more casualties as a result of freezing weather than all the efforts of the Amaris Empire combined. Progress towards Unity City was very slow. The SLDF suffered a major loss when the Stonewall Jackson Division was destroyed near Charlottesville by the 84th and 89th Amaris Dragoons. The Imperial forces moved north to intercept the rest of 1st Army, but were ambushed by the Footsack and 114th Hussars, after which they withdrew into the Appalachians. It took 3 weeks to pin the Dragoons down and destroy them. 10th Army faced only minor obstacles at Pittsburgh and Detroit, while the 15th streaked ahead through Canada. Back at the Gold Coast, the Van Diemen Division was spearheading the Mexico battle group's advance north, up the Sierra Nevada mountains. To their west, the rest of the California battle group reached the continent, and together they advanced up past San Francisco. The Amaris divisions in front of them were very disciplined in their slow withdrawal north. Kerensky attempted to surround them with surprise coastal landings, but the Imperial units maintained discipline and withdrew into Oregon. The SLDF tried landing dropships in the rear to break the AEAF, but again this proved unsuccessful. 10th Army continued their advance west, liberating Chicago and then moving towards Wisconsin. The last significant opposition they faced in the Midwest was the 2nd Mexican Legion, which fled towards Unity City after taking more than 50% casualties. The 1st and 10th crossed the Mississippi, the former advancing into the Rocky Mountains, while the rest of the Southeast Battle Group landed at Charleston, South Carolina behind them. Their goal now was to reach the Gunnison Castle Bryan and link up with the Mexico Battle Group beyond. 15th Army completed their march through Canada, heading south to regroup at Spokane, after which the Northeast Battle Group pacified the area around Banks Lake. By the end of May, the Operation Anchorhead Task Force had advanced in sight of Vancouver Island. The first of 3 regiments began crossing on June 3rd, securing the coast shortly afterwards. Until this point, the Central Asia Battle Group had been held in reserve, but on June 7th, fresh reinforcements from 19th Army arrived to help take Victoria. By this point in the war, many of the divisions within the SLDF were less than 40% operational, and so the reserve was desperately needed. However, the 4 experienced battalions defending the island managed to slow the overwhelming SLDF force in the mountains. On the mainland, the Northern Inland Battle Group was making their first assault on Kamloops, but were repulsed by Imperial units within. A second attempt followed a couple weeks later, but was again turned back. The main battle lines had been drawn up along the Columbia River surrounding Unity City. 14th Army was the first to arrive early in June, with the 3rd hot on their heels. Soon, 3 armies were besieging Portland, while the 1st moved into a supporting role behind them. To the east, 6th and 10th Armies took up positions at Kennewick. They were the only units to make it across the Columbia in June, but were forced to withdraw in the face of stiff opposition. Lastly, 15th Army was the furthest upriver at Wenatchee. While they were preparing their assault, they re-established contact with Elizabeth Hazen, leader of the Ghosts of the Black Watch. Despite Amaris's best efforts to eradicate them, the First Lord's former bodyguards had refused to die and fought a guerrilla campaign lasting a dozen years. The defenders at Kamloops were finally overrun at the 3rd time of asking on June 28th, with the last of the Imperial forces hunted down over the next 2 days. SLDF Pathfinders also crossed to the Olympic Peninsula towards the end of the month. As 16th Army closed on Vancouver, the Imperial Brigade within recalled its forces from the island. The SLDF reached the city's outskirts on July 15th, with 19th Army crossing soon after to assist in the blockade. The rest of the northern coast and inland battle groups mopped up the last of the resistance in British Columbia, then spent the next month preparing for their assault on Unity City. The second crossing of the Columbia ended in disaster for the people of Portland. One of the dams upriver was destroyed to sweep away the advancing SLDF, but in the process devastated a quarter of the city. After laying siege to Portland for 3 weeks, Kerensky moved his armies in to assist the civilian population and eliminate the last of the defenders. 10th Army was able to establish a permanent beachhead across the river in July. Serenity Under Fire pursued the retreating forces up into the Rattlesnake Hills, while Back to the Stone Age flanked the defenders at Kennewick, allowing 6th Army to cross. The Erwin Rommel Division, meanwhile, was leading 4th Corps in an assault on Yakima, capturing the city on July 26th. The Northeast Battle Group now closed ranks and prepared to advance on Unity City from the east. The last line of defences were located within the Cascade Mountains, where hidden weapon emplacements threatened to exact a heavy toll. Before they began their assault, they caught a member of the local resistance trying to infiltrate their camp. This transpired to be none other than Colleen Schmidt, granddaughter of the former Royal Blackwatch Colonel Hanny Schmidt. She was able to report on all the concealed firing positions within the mountains, though it still took until the end of August to eliminate them all.
Despite over a decade of crackdowns by the various branches of the imperial government, Amaris had never succeeded in ridding Terra of resistance movements. They were particularly prevalent within North America. The exploits of Elizabeth Hazen and the Ghosts of the Black Watch are well documented, but others, such as rebels operating out of the Cascade Mountains, did their part to disrupt the Empire's function. Another band, known as the Spirit of the Coyote, made the southwestern deserts a dangerous area to operate in for the Empire. One remarkable individual to come out of this group was Dana Kufal. Her parents were part of the Terran security forces that had escaped the coup but were tracked down in 2773 when she was less than a year old. Adopted by a group of Native American freedom fighters, she grew up learning both the tactics of the armed resistance but also their spiritual connection to their namesake animal. When the SLDF made contact with the Coyote tribe, they were shocked to discover that an 8-year-old girl was helping to overthrow Amaris.
Meanwhile, 6th Army was racing downriver to assist the units in Portland. The last of the defenders were overcome on August 20th, but a desperate final action from the Amaris Empire saw all its reserve regiments push south to try and halt the 6 SLDF armies approaching from that direction. They delayed the inevitable for only a week, and now there was nothing stopping a direct assault on the capital. Every day that passed, numerous dropships made desperate attempts to flee into space, rats fleeing a sinking ship, but most were shot down. One of the few units to escape were the last survivors of the 2nd Mexican Legion. The city itself had just one loyal division left to defend it, Commanding General Patrick Scoffin's own 7th Amaris Dragoons. On the opposite coast, one of Amaris's close allies, Director of Economic Development Ashlyn Connor, was picked up by the SLDF at her home in New York, having made no attempt to flee the inevitable. Starleague intelligence was becoming increasingly concerned by the apparent disappearance of another of Amaris's inner circle, OPD Director Lisa Outerbridge. Sightings had become increasingly scarce throughout Operation Liberation, and by 2779 they had lost track of her entirely. The hunt was on to locate one of the SLDF's most wanted. On September 1st, the SLDF began tightening the noose. 3rd Army cleared the region around Aberdeen, allowing for the safe arrival of the fresh 2nd Army. 2 days later, pathfinders from the Pride of Puget Sound became the first to lay eyes on Unity City. What they saw was a barren, irradiated landscape. Olympia, Tacoma, and Seattle had been all but abandoned due to the damage done to the region during the Amaris coup. Some cleanup had been done to make the capital livable, but it was a shadow of its former glory. Kerensky himself took to the field for the first time since Moscow at the head of the Graham Division. 3rd and 16th Armies took point, entering Unity City on September 10th. Naturally, Kerensky became the priority target for the Dragoons, who did everything they could to kill him, some even using suicide tactics. His usual bodyguard was expanded by the addition of the last few survivors of the Royal Black Watch, who had re-established contact during the North American campaign, and together they kept him safe. With such overwhelming numbers on their side, the battle for Unity City wasn't much to write home about. As Kerensky advanced, he came into contact with civilians who warned him that he would not find his quarry within the courts of the Starleague. On the 13th, the Tsar Peter Division reached the Royal Palace, ignition point for the entire war, and confirmed his fears. Emperor Stefan Amaris was nowhere to be found. The last of the 7th Amaris Dragoons were making a desperate push for the spaceport at this time, but after the destruction of their dropships on September 16th, Patrick Scoffins extended an offer of surrender. The terms of his surrender were simple. In exchange for the fair treatment of the Amaris Empire armed forces, Scoffins would give them the location of Emperor Amaris. Kerensky accepted, and his counterpart turned over everything he knew. The Emperor had not set foot in Unity City for years. Since even before Operation Liberation began early in 2777, Amaris had been cooped up within the Imperial Palace constructed by his old friend, First Lord Richard Cameron. It was a well-disguised complex within the nature reserve around Lake Louise, so much so that the 15th Army had marched almost straight over it during their approach towards Unity City. Defending the palace was General Peter Bridge at the head of the last of the Imperial forces, the 4th Amaris Dragoons. The newly arrived 2nd and 19th armies would encircle the facility, cutting off any chance of escape on the ground. Overhead, Admiral Brandt would command the warship blockade to ensure Amaris didn't flee into space, while Colonel Stephen McKenna provided close air support. Kerensky handed control of the Graham Division to his deputy de Chevalier and tasked them with taking the spaceport, while the commanding general would lead the Pride of Puget Sound and the Lionhearted Division in the main assault on the palace. On September 29th, 0200 Terra Standard Time, a small armada of dropships departed Unity City, heading over the Canadian wilderness. Every battle mech in 3rd Army had been consolidated into the 26th Royal, amounting to just 3 regiments. This put them on equal footing with the 4th Amaris Dragoons. From high above, they leapt from their dropships and crashed to earth around the spaceport, quickly securing the facility. They held their ground against the best the defenders could throw against them, long enough for the rest of the SLDF to touch down. Together, they overwhelmed and destroyed the 4th Amaris Dragoons, avenging the deaths of the Royal Blackwatch, those at the Citadel, and so many others within Unity City during the coup. Together with their escorts, Kerensky and de Chevalier rushed the gates of the Imperial Palace, smashing their way through the last of the defences and prompting the last of the Republican Guard to throw down their weapons. The Star League officers marched their mechs through the towering halls of the palace until they reached the Emperor's private quarters. A young secretary emerged, leading by the arm a tired and feeble old man, Emperor Stefan Amaris. He placed at the feet of Kerensky's mech the jewel-encrusted laser pistol which he had once gifted to Richard Cameron. And with his surrender, the Star League Civil War was over. For all intents and purposes, the surrender of Emperor Stefan Amaris to Commanding General Alexander Kerensky on September 29, 2779, ended the Star League Civil War. This was broadcast to the wider hegemony and inner sphere the next day, prompting many to lay down their arms. Not all of the Amaris loyalists believed the news at first, and fighting continued at each of the North American Castles Bryan for a time. November 12th is the official end date to the war, though holdouts like the 3rd Mexican Legion in Africa fought into early 2780, and the very last pocket of resistance at Lawrence, Kansas lasted until February 11th. That same year, the last of the Casper drones within the distant Kuiper Belt was located and destroyed. With it died the once formidable space defense system. Only isolated ground installations survived the war, and humanity would never again experiment with advanced artificial intelligence on such a large scale. Of the Amaris Empire armed forces, which at their height had numbered almost 400 regiments, only 9 had survived. The Star League Defense Force was similarly shattered. The Navy had begun the conflict with a fleet of well over 2,000 warships. The SDSs had made them suffer, and less than 20% had escaped destruction. The regular army could at one time call upon 2,000 mech regiments. Now, only 635 remained, but those numbers belie the fact that less than half were even 50% operational. The member state militaries had survived the conflict more or less unscathed. The size of their standing armies remained curiously stagnant throughout the war, but this is because most of their military industrial output had been sold off to the desperate SLDF for enormous profits. Those funds had been redirected into increased warship production, which the Star League Civil War had shown would be a crucial aspect of any future conflict. Indeed, their navies had more than doubled since 2765. 15 years of fighting had changed the face of the inner sphere and periphery almost beyond recognition. No one was quite sure what was going to happen next. All eyes turned to Commanding General Alexander Kerensky. the territorial states of the Magistracy of Canopus, Outworlds Alliance, and Taurian Concordat had notionally won their freedom. Would they be allowed to keep it now that Amaris was defeated? The Rimworld's Republic, largest of all the Periphery realms, no longer existed. The Lyran Commonwealth had annexed their weaker neighbours, and President Lucian Dormax had disappeared into one of the Lyran Intelligence Corps' cells, never to be seen again. Would Kerensky now take action as he had threatened during Operation Almanac? Would the Oberon Confederation or newly formed Finnmark Free Republic rise to take the place of the Rimworlds within the Star League? Would the Commanding General seek vengeance against the Free Worlds League for denying him aid and later trying to seize hegemony worlds? What about the Draconis Combine, who had tacitly supported the Empire and publicly decried Kerensky? Could the Terran hegemony hold together in the aftermath of such a brutal war? What had happened to House Cameron, and who would become the next First Lord? Most importantly of all, what would happen now to Stefan Amaris? To say that many wanted to see him dead would be a colossal understatement. Finding guards to keep him safe from others within the SLDF became a serious challenge for the victorious general. Kerensky vowed that he would stand trial, however, and for the time being, Amaris, his wife Tabori, and their children were held captive in the Imperial Palace. Not long after the official ceasefire, soldiers sifting through the wreckage of the Royal Palace unsealed the throne room for the first time in over 12 years. The scene within was horrific to see. The bodies of the dead Cameron family had been left to rot where they fell. 2 weeks later, Kerensky arrived to see the massacre for himself. He stood alone in the desecrated throne room for 30 minutes, and then immediately departed for Amaris' Canadian redoubt. The Emperor and his family were marched out into the courtyard to meet him, and lined up against the wall. A firing squad positioned themselves opposite. Blindfolds were offered and refused, after which Kerensky gave the order. Stefan Amaris' death on November 25, 2779 was ultimately just one more on top of the approximately 125 million killed during the Star League Civil War. A further 500 million were wounded during the conflict, and more than 1 billion were left homeless. A compelling argument could be made that it indirectly led to many times those numbers, but future events would make the true figures all but unknowable. Regardless, the hegemony had sustained losses not seen since the Taurian Concordat theatre during the Reunification War, possibly even greater. The fractured people tried to piece themselves back together, but much of the damage was too severe. The commanding general fretted about what to do with Amaris' remains for some time. The last thing he wanted was for his final resting site to become a place of pilgrimage for his supporters, nor did he wish to create rumours of his survival should he destroy the body. Instead, he decided that he would donate it to be used in lab studies, an inglorious end to the man responsible for so much bloodshed. One unusual consequence of the war was the split in the Catholic Church. The New Avalon branch had been shunned by the rest of the Inner Sphere, who instead chose Cardinal Vladimir Kosev of the People's Union of Kazakh to be their pope on March 21st. Their inability to see eye to eye was indicative of the great divides that had emerged in the final years of the Star League. In the aftermath, Alexander Kerensky returned to Geneva and resumed his position as protector of the realm. Many expected to see him follow this up with an announcement that he would rule as First Lord of the Star League, but it did not come at this time. Instead, he declared that there would be free elections for every planetary congress, beginning on May 3rd. What followed was a complete shunning of any individual who had been associated with Amaris. Many worlds had ample reason to hate the Empire, but others sought to wash their hands of their own involvement and complicity in its actions. Jens Panera returned from retirement to resume his post as Director General Pro Tem, but he was one of the few moderates elected. Most were out for blood. Terrible crimes were committed in the name of vengeance. Anyone who had worked within the Empire's bureaucracy was permanently tarred, sometimes literally branded. Reprisal killings were not unheard of, and others took advantage of the witch hunt to fabricate evidence of their rivals' involvement to have them removed. The Berlin Protocols barred any former member of the administrative branches from holding office in the new government. This left the hegemony leadership woefully underskilled for the task of rebuilding post-war. Kerensky's efforts to restore civilian government had backfired in the worst way. The anti-Amarist sentiment only grew as people began to learn of the atrocities committed by the empire, culminating in the discovery of the Tivoli mines on May 23rd. The Kryptia, Hegemony Security Force, and Office of Policy and Doctrine had spent the last 15 years kidnapping anyone who spoke out against Amaris. Those people had to end up somewhere. The mines were just the worst of several such facilities. Within, they found 2,600 prisoners driven mad by the long dark isolation, and a further 20,000 bodies. Among the others found dead in the wake of the conflict were Ambassador Drago Kurita and his family, murdered by Amaris's goons within their home in the final days of the war. Bringing justice to those responsible became the top priority for the new hegemony government. On June 7th, they announced the Geneva War Trials, in which 37 major war criminals would be tried, charged with genocide, war crimes, crimes against the Stalag, and crimes against humanity. Other regional and planetary courts would be holding their own trials in concert. Amaris's inner circle were at the forefront, as were several notable generals, the former president of the Terran Congress, other ministers, and some of the worst criminals within the armed forces, such as the survivors of the 201st Amaris Lancers. Several on the list attempted to flee. Samir and Jari had already been captured at Geneva 3 years earlier, as had Aisling Connor and Patrick Scoffins, as well as Amaris's cousin Rifkin shortly after the war's end. The trials began on August 21st, by which point all but 3 individuals had been located. The remnants of the Department of the Attorney General led proceedings, alongside members of the Judge Advocate General Command. 19 were sentenced to death by hanging, including Peter Amaris, Samir Injari, Lisa Outerbridge, and Patrick Scoffins. A further 14 were given extended prison sentences, which included Aisling Connor. Often, this was just delaying the inevitable, as many perished during their incarceration. Some never made it that far. On September 17th, a member of the Kryptia was able to smuggle poison into Injari's cell. The head of the once mighty Rimworld secret society took his own life. Around this time, the Council Lords began to return to Earth for their first meeting since before the Periphery Uprising. Each was invited to attend the executions on October 9th, though only John Davian and Minoru Kurita did so. Commanding General Patrick Scoffins became the last of Amaris's inner circle to meet their fate at the Geneva War Trials, dying before the eyes of his wife, daughter, and grandchildren. Director Lisa Outerbridge of the OPD remained the most prominent of those never found in the aftermath of the war. The belief at the time was that she had been killed during the final year of Operation Liberation, but more recent evidence suggests she had escaped justice by using a false ID to flee to South America, where she presumably lived to old age. An unpalatable end to the woman behind some of the worst atrocities of the era. One day after the hangings, the High Council began their first session since their dismissal by Richard Cameron in 2763. Present at the meeting were First Prince John Davian, Coordinator Minoru Kurita, Chancellor Barbara Liao, Captain General Kenyon Manick, and Archon Robert Steiner, but of the associate members, only Protector Nicoletta Calderon attended. Her exclusion from the meeting would be tacit acceptance of the informal granting of independence at the end of her Freedom War, but she could not afford to be absent should Kerensky renege on that agreement. The Commanding General was present in his capacity as Protector of the Realm. Representing the SLDF and those worlds under martial law was his deputy, Aaron de Chevalier, and President Jens Panetta attended on behalf of the Terran hegemony. One of the few points of agreement among the Council Lords was that the Prime Circuit be restored as quickly as possible, and the Neutral Communications Ministry continue to operate. The hyperpulse generators at Geneva and Tacoma were found to be complete write-offs. but the discovery of an incomplete facility kept hidden from Amaris gave them hope that Terra could soon be reconnected with the rest of the Inner Sphere. Nicoletta Calderon suggested that the best candidate to lead the administrative branch was Jerome Blake, who was both supremely qualified and somewhat of a folk hero. Blake was at the time working on the completion of the Hilton Head HPG facility and remained unaware of discussions until the High Council reached an agreement on October 14th. Only John Davian abstained from the vote, the rest appointing him as Minister of Communications. Unfortunately, this was one of the rare moments of consensus among the Council, and with it devolving into bickering soon after, Calderon took her leave and returned to the Concordat after it became clear that the member states had little interest in the periphery. Of the many thousands of decisions that the High Council would need to make, all were secondary compared to the key issue on everyone's minds: who would become the next First Lord? Alexander Kerensky had become a legend across all of human colonized space, and it very quickly became clear that he would not be voted in. Privately, this suited Alexander just fine. He did not have a desire to rule, and since publicly he did not have a family and did not wish to expose his children to the world of politics, his assumption of the position would only lead to an inevitable succession crisis down the line. Regardless, his frustration continued to build over the first week as he listened to the petty bickering going on around him. It became apparent that he would be an obstacle in the path of every one of the Council Lord's schemes. On October 18th, Robert Steiner made a proposal that would later shock the Inner Sphere. He moved to have Kerensky stripped of his title of Protector of the Realm and his position within the High Council revoked. His reasons for doing so came largely from the fear that the Commanding General might declare that Operation Almanac be reversed and the Rimworld's government be reinstated. Before anyone stopped to contemplate the far-reaching consequences of their actions, each Council Lord had given their assent. As John Davian began to read their pronouncement into the record, Alexander stood and motioned him to silence. Standing before them, he methodically worked across his uniform, removing every medal, commendation, insignia, and badge of office. Turning to the robe he wore as protector, he tore the garment in half, then simply left. The memoirs of those present reveal a mix of emotions. Some of the council felt they had achieved a victory against an old enemy, or even nemesis. Others were suddenly confronted with the foolishness of their actions and expressed a deep regret. Kerensky departed for New Earth soon after, where he once again took charge of the battered Stali Defense Force. To prevent public outcry, the High Council had confirmed him in his post as Commanding General, but had decreed that Terra become demilitarized and the SLDF return to their peacetime stations. Kerensky was not inclined to do either though. On November 21st, the Chevalier informed him that he had spoken to every army and corps commander within the Defense Force, and that every one of them was prepared to back Alexander in overthrowing the High Council. Kerensky, however, still remained loyal to the ideals of the Star League and declined the offer. This did not prevent the anti-Council Lord sentiment from growing within the SLDF, and a cabal formed around Major General Lauren Hayes continued to plan such an operation, codenamed Case Red. The hegemony during this time was in serious turmoil. The situation on a given planet depended on its proximity to the realm's borders. The Outer Worlds had been liberated first, and had years to recover during the closing stages of the war, all while the member states were flooding them with aid in an effort to entice them to switch sides. The core systems were affected the most by the escalating destruction, and had the least amount of time to rebuild. In the years immediately following the ceasefire, the hegemony population migrated outwards. Nowhere was this more pronounced than on Terra itself, where half of the 12 billion inhabitants departed for new homes. After 11 months of constant deliberations, tensions within the High Council had soared beyond recovery. Each leader had advanced their own name as a candidate for First Lord, but no agreement could be reached. Attempts at bribery and intimidation had not succeeded. John Davian insisted that Richard Cameron had named him regent, but others were sure that was a pathetic ruse. One among them knew the truth, however. In one of Richard's last correspondence, he had informed the Kuritan Lord of his decision, but Minoru held his tongue. On August 12, 2781, the Council Lords finally agreed to disagree, and went their separate ways. A brief statement was issued declaring that the High Council was disbanding permanently. With that announcement, every administrative branch of the Bureau of Starleague Affairs ceased operations, save for the Ministry of Communications. Again, Kerensky was pressured to take up the mantle himself, but once more he refused. Instead, he spent the next 2 years travelling between the member states, hoping to convince them to resume dialogues with their neighbours in the hope of saving the Starleague. They each received him politely, save Kenyon Marek, who spurned an audience and dispatched the Speaker of the Parliament to dismiss him, but none were moved by his words. Jerome Blake, meanwhile, was contacting the former council lords asking them for direction. Those that responded essentially gave him carte blanche to do as he wished. One of his first changes was to increase the price of sending official or military messages through the HPGs, using the additional funds to assist in the recovery effort. On April 12, 2783, Jerome decided to halt reconstruction efforts at Unity City, declaring that the court of the Starleague would remain empty until a new First Lord was chosen. By then, the worst of the humanitarian crisis had been dealt with, and Blake's name within the hegemony, particularly on Terra, was revered. 2783 was the year that the member states abandoned the pretense that they wanted the hegemony to survive. Several of the shared border worlds had already been unofficially claimed, but now the Terran-appointed administrators and government were ushered out entirely, sometimes at gunpoint. The first system to realign itself officially was Surma on July 19th. Furthermore, worlds that were firmly within the Terran provinces were also picked at by each of their neighbours, as were border worlds between the other member states. Most troubling was the security forces dispatched by Chancellor Barbara Liao to the infamous world of Andurian.
Even after the conclusion of the war and the disbandment of the High Council, the Starleague Defense Force was still receiving an influx of new recruits. Two such individuals who showed incredible promise but were too young to serve during the Civil War were David Kolassa and Rafe Cardan. Each had the potential to become future leaders before they disappeared out of the history books. Their home nations would much rather have retained their services within their own house militaries than see them join up with Kerensky, and so in the final years of the Starleague, they did what they could to impede SLDF recruitment.
Throughout this period, the house militaries were continuing to expand. Some estimates say they had quadrupled in the 30 years since Directive 30 was repealed. Though the true figures don't quite match this exaggeration, it's unquestionable that each nation saw war in its near future. The latest wave of growth came from the many Amaris Empire Armed Forces personnel that were gradually being released from custody. Many of these went on to form new commands within the member or territorial states, some becoming mercenaries, whereas others turned pirate. In August, the Federated Suns began approaching the Starleague forces within its domain and offering them generous bonuses to abandon the SLDF and sign on with the AFFS. By the time the news reached Kerensky, the other member states had followed suit and were trying to lure other units to their side. The commanding general demanded that such actions cease immediately, but the council lords were not cowed, and instead ordered Kerensky to step down as head of the Starleague Defense Force, something which he did not do. One incident that was indicative of the crumbling SLDF was the case of the Czech Lancers. Only 4 battalions had survived the periphery campaigns. Those who hadn't retired or turned pirate remained in reserve throughout the rest of the war. By 2783, the 3 colonels had turned on each other, imprisoning a third of their number, while the rest continued to butt heads. When the Lyrans approached and offered a deal, while one battalion refused outright, another accepted a mercenary contract with the Commonwealth as the Iron Ravens. Their first mission was to spring their companions from internment, something which cost the lives of dozens of hegemony loyalists. It's theorized that Alexander Kerensky decided on his next course of action that September. The continued defection of several more full regiments confirmed his fears about what would happen to the Starleague Defense Force if he did nothing. After first discussing it with his deputy de Chevalier, he informed Jerome Blake of his intentions that winter at the completion ceremony for the Hilton Head HPG. Throughout the latter months of 2783, the Terran shipyards, both big and small, were servicing record numbers of warships, jumpships, and dropships. On February 14, 2784, Kerensky summoned every department head and army or fleet commander, as well as 223 other senior officers of the SLDF, to a nondescript warehouse on Earth. There, he outlined his plans for the future. The Inner Sphere was heading for war, and nothing the Stalag Defense Force could do would prevent that. They theoretically still had the strongest military in existence, with as many mechs as the other 5 member states combined, but they were leading an exhausted army with a devastated industrial base over which they only maintained a tenuous political hold. Even if they could supplant one of the ruling houses and somehow hold together a realm many times the size of the hegemony with a populace that would be fervently anti-Stalag, the other 4 would simply sweep up the pieces behind them. Similarly, if they stayed in place, they would only be making themselves the biggest target and bringing yet more destruction to the realm they had only just liberated. The longer they remained and did nothing, the more units would be enticed to join up with the other house militaries. The harder they fought to protect the Stalag, the greater the odds that the Council Lords would turn to weapons of mass destruction to remove them. From Kerensky's perspective, this left only one option: exodus. They would lead the SLDF into exile, beyond the Inner Sphere and territorial states, into the deep periphery and uncharted space. There, they would find a new home for themselves, and forge a realm that maintained the ideals of the Stalag, leaving behind the chaos that was surely to come. His proposal was met with rapturous applause. Not everyone agreed, however. For starters, Jerome Blake thought he was mad to depart now when there was still so much to be done. Among his own officers, resistance coalesced around Major General Lauren Hayes. She did not want to abandon the Inner Sphere, but she was also certainly opposed to offering her services to the House Lords. Kerensky was able to reach a compromise. Every individual within the SLDF would be offered a choice, to stay or go. Those that remained would swear allegiance to the last vestige of the Stalag government, Jerome Blake's Ministry of Communications. Word of the planned departure was kept tightly under wraps. Over time, the entire defense force was polled, and almost 80% agreed to leave with Kerensky, representing more than 1,000 regiments, some 2 million men and women, and a further 4 million dependents. Out of respect for their fellow soldiers, those who wished to remain kept silent. Such a massive migration was going to require vast numbers of ships, and so the Stalag went on a spending spree, picking up another 200 transports over the next few months. In total, the Exodus fleet consisted of 402 warships and 1,349 freighters. Not everyone was lucky enough to hear about the plan. The mercenaries who had fought and died alongside the SLDF were notably left in the dark, including many retired Stalag soldiers among their ranks. Each member state continued to swallow up worlds along the hegemony borders throughout 2784, while simultaneously shutting down Stalag oversight on shared planets within their own realms. Barbara Liao had worked to secure the Andurian commonality the previous year, and now dispatched troops towards the second most contentious planet among the Liao people, the disputed Chesterton system. There had already been a brief inconclusive border war just 20 years prior. This apparent aggression caused First Prince John Davian to call in SLDF aid, but they were far too busy to listen to his request.
Of all the mysteries born out of the fall of the Stalag, perhaps the greatest is the legend of a surviving heir to the throne spirited away in the night. Many variations of the story exist, and no doubt most of these myths can be attributed to wishful thinking by Cameron loyalists living under occupation, but perhaps there is some element of truth to them. Conspiracy theorists have often claimed that Richard's child was not killed during the Throne Room massacre, though there are competing ideas as to how they might have survived. One popular theory suggests that before her tragic death, the infant Amanda Cameron was exchanged for another poor child who took her place in Elise Graham's arms. Exactly when such a swap could have happened isn't clear, as Amanda and Elise were secured almost immediately during the coup. A more fanciful notion that some believe is that Elise gave birth to twins, Amanda and a boy named Ian. Hiding the existence of one of the heirs is an idea that has some merit to it when you consider that Simon Cameron had been assassinated just 15 years earlier, and that armed rebellion was already taking place at the time of their birth. Unfortunately, any plan to keep one of the First Lord's twins a secret was fundamentally flawed from the start. If there was one person who Richard would likely have confided in, it would have been Stefan Amaris. He would have acted quickly, and Ian would no doubt have met the same sad fate as his parents. For centuries, these legends were mere speculation, but in 2979, new information came to light. 200 years after the end of the war, the Taurian Concordat discovered an abandoned Black Lion-class warship drifting in an uncolonized system near New Vandenberg, the SLS Tirpitz. Our best sources claim the vessel was stationed within the Terran system on the day of the coup, making it one of only 3 vessels known to have escaped. Could it be that a Cameron survivor had been evacuated and made their way to Kerensky out in the periphery? Before the Taurians could recover any information from the warship's computers, it was attacked and destroyed by an unknown raiding force with Starleague-era equipment. Their origin and motive remain unknown, but they were subsequently dubbed the Vandenberg White Wings. Another shocking discovery made even more recently might finally lift the veil of mystery on this whole affair. Recovered from the radioactive ruins of Fort Cameron at Unity City was a journal belonging to none other than Colonel Hanny Schmidt of the Royal Black Watch. Her last entries tell a story that beggars belief. After her meeting with Richard Cameron on December 12, 2766, where she failed to convince him of the looming threat posed by Amaris, she put into motion a contingency plan a year in the making. At the first sign of trouble, Major Ian McIntosh would soon switch not just Amanda, but Richard Cameron himself with a body double. From there, the 3 of them would head to the waiting Colossus-class SLS Abyss and depart from Puget Sound for SLS Tirpitz above Luna. Schmidt expressed regret at ordering her subordinate to forcibly remove the First Lord from danger while she herself led the Black Watch in a diversionary final stand. What she could not have known is that Amaris' Operation Apotheosis was so precisely timed that the very first shot to signify its commencement was the one that killed her First Lord. Major McIntosh was likely one of the Black Watch jump infantry that tried heroically to breach the throne room in an effort to rescue their sovereign. The Tirpitz would tragically leave Terra empty-handed. Some knowledge of this plot must have survived the coup and gone on to spawn the rumours of a swap taking place. Furthermore, conflating the name of one of the conspirators, Ian McIntosh, along with the planned evacuation of 2 Camerons appears to be the origin of the twin legend. If the Vandenberg White Wings had only a partial understanding of events on the day of the coup, they may have believed that by destroying the derelict battlecruiser, they were covering up the existence of a Cameron survivor, but failed to realise that none had ever made it off-world. One more fascinating possibility exists, and it is perhaps the most plausible of all these many theories. The legend states that Richard's sole child Amanda was indeed killed, but another heir had been born to his sister Helena. Their pregnancy was a little-known fact at the time, and it's unclear whether she had given birth before she met her end alongside the rest of her family. Stefan Amaris was even reported to have said that her brother Richard was the father, though the veracity of the Mad Emperor's words are unclear. If there was a child, they were not found with their dead mother, as all the bodies were accounted for. It seems unlikely that Amaris would have had them killed separately, given the spectacle he aimed to create with the massacre to begin with. It is equally unlikely that the Emperor was holding Helena's child hostage. 13 years passed between the coup and his downfall, and more than enough time to make some announcement, which he never did. Likewise, had an heir ever reached Kerensky, he would surely have made it known. Their existence would have done enormous damage to the legitimacy of the Empire, making the commanding general's job that much easier. Unless, of course, Alexander had already grown disillusioned by the time he became aware of them. In the aftermath of the battle for Moscow, Kerensky was reunited with his wife and 2 boys. Around this time, they were approached by a woman named Megan Cole and her foster child Jessica. Incomplete reports from the day state the girl was actually Jerome Winston's sister, Jennifer, found to be living in the city with Nicholas and Andrei, but his family records show no trace of her. More recently unearthed documents suggest that Megan Cole was a former retainer of Richard Cameron's sister Helena. She fled the capital during the coup, apparently taking the infant Jessica with her. The girl's true identity remains a mystery that may never be answered, one of many who would soon leave their old lives behind to start again in uncharted space.
On July 8, 2784, Commanding General Alexander Kerensky dispatched a one-word message across the HBG network: Exodus. With that, the entire SLDF began packing up and departing their home systems. The House Lords demanded an explanation about where all the troops were moving to, but by way of answer, they received only a simple "out on extended maneuvers" transmission. The largest fleet was departing from the Hegemony Corps. With them was Kerensky himself, his wife Katusha, and their 2 boys. Even at this late hour, the existence of Alexander's family remained a closely guarded secret. Their journey began by jumping from New Earth and Terra to Deiron and then on to Styx. Panic within the Draconis Combine soared as they saw the Armada approach. Kurita had been one of the most antagonistic of all towards Kerensky, and had even supported the Amaris Empire. Now it seemed the SLDF was coming to make them pay. The usual route towards Luthien would take a jump ship next to the Telos system, but confusion grew and the Star League instead jumped to Dena Balgedi. They did end up crossing the border, making it as far as Annapolis before turning spinward. On October 2nd, the first SLDF ships began appearing within the New Samarkand system. This was the pre-arranged meeting site, and over the coming weeks, more and more transports and warships arrived, completely taking over the jump points and restricting travel. HBG traffic was also on lockdown, a parting gift from Jerome Blake. Commanding the Draconis Combine Recharge Station at New Samarkand was Officer Raymond Sainz. He was the only Kuritan to whom the SLDF would talk, a necessity of using his facility. Despite assurances that this was not an invasion fleet, the destruction of 4 Kuritan aerospace fighters that approached the Armada left some serious doubts in his mind. Sainz himself would disappear a month later after being called aboard Kerensky's flagship, SLS McKenna's Pride. We can only speculate as to what was said, as the DCMS officer never returned, though whether he was offered a place among them, stowed away on board, or met some other fate, we don't know. Among the Draconis Combine High Command, Minoru Kurita's warlords were urging immediate military action as their only hope of survival. Chief among them was his son Jinjiro, the warlord of Galadon. However, the coordinator felt differently. With growing conviction, he believed he understood what Kerensky was planning. When pressed by his commanders on what their orders were, he told them to hold station, responding that masterless warriors tend to gather together before departing a burning castle. The former capital received a flood of civilian traffic as the families aboard the Star League transports landed to spend their final weeks within the inner sphere on solid ground. The fleet also unloaded any unusable scrap that they had stripped for parts, dumping it into the asteroid field. Before departing, Kerensky approached the medical school at the University of New Samarkand and offered them a grisly donation: the preserved body of Emperor Stefan Amaris. The last transport arrived at New Samarkand on November 1st. The next day, those on planet were ordered to pack up and return to their ships. On the 5th, the first vessel jumped out towards the periphery. One by one, the rest of the fleet began to vanish. With them went some of the greatest minds and legendary figures in human history, and perhaps the sole hope of sparing the inner sphere from the coming carnage. New Samarkand had become the busiest system in all of human space, but as the jump points emptied, only ghosts were left behind. It took a full day for the fleet to depart, until only McKenna's Pride remained. Commanding General Alexander Kerensky took one final look at the worlds he had sacrificed everything to defend, before ordering his ship to jump, taking with them the last light of the Cameron star. and they were never seen again.